New York Bio hosted our first ever Patient Engagement Summit in April 2021, bringing together leaders from industry, advocacy organizations, and patients and caregivers for an event centered on the role and voice of the patient in biotech innovation. We'd like to thank our sponsors, including our presenting sponsor, Pfizer, our panel sponsors, Semaphore, Circuit Clinical, Ovid Therapeutics, and Bristol Myers Squibb, as well as Alexion, Horizon, Lexeo Therapeutics, and UCB. We're also fortunate to have several patient organization partners, including the American Cancer Society's Cancer Action Network, the AMED Alliance, the Allergy and Asthma Network, the Arthritis Foundation, the Association of Oncology Social Work, the Autoimmune Registry, the Children's Tumor Foundation, the Crohn's and Colitis Foundation, the International Pain Foundation, the Lupus and Allied Diseases Association, the National Eczema Association, New York Oncology and Hematology, Patients Rising, Sickle Cell Thalassemia Patients Network, and Stronger Than Sarcoidosis. This panel is on increasing diversity in clinical trials, sponsored by Circuit Clinical, featuring Diana Vega from Allstripes, Jordine Blaze from Bluebird Bio, Lanelle Doyle as a patient panelist, and moderated by Irfan Khan of Circuit Clinical.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Irfan Khan, founder and CEO of Circuit Clinical, an integrated research organization based in upstate New York, which brings clinical trials to patients where they get their health care. And I'm really thrilled to be moderating a panel today to talk about improving diversity in clinical trials. It's a topic that's near and dear to our work. We have experts today that I think will really bring a robust discussion and an actionable discussion about what can be done to seriously address the problem and to take positive steps forward in the near term, rather than looking downfield for idealized solutions. I'm really pleased that we have a group of operators who can speak from direct experience in clinical trials. So with us today, we have Dr. Diana Vega from Allstripes, Jordine Blaze from Bluebird Bio, and Lanelle Doyle, a patient panelist, to give us the sort of holistic 360 experience. And I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves today. Diana, would you like to start?
Thank you so much, Irfan. Hello, my name is Diana Vega, and I am Research Partnership Director at Allstripes. Allstripes Research is a medical science company that specializes in rare conditions. This company, initially called RDMD, was created with the patient in mind, and they continue to be the North Star of the company. And actually, one of its co-founders, Anna Faber, was diagnosed as a young adult with neurofibromatosis 2, or NF2, a rare condition that has been associated with rare cancers and the risk of losing eyesight and hearing and mobility. And as a patient, he realized very quickly that siloing of data led to lack of therapies for people with rare conditions, and that it shouldn't be hard for patients to be involved in research if they wish to be, especially having knowledge, like firsthand knowledge and data that can help expedite discoveries. So Allstripes provides a platform that is specific for people with rare conditions, that empowers people with these diseases to contribute to research by unlocking data that is stored in their patient medical records, with the goal of accelerating treatment development for people with rare conditions. At Allstripes, my role is to identify opportunities that and design potential research collaborations where the Allstripes platform data could be best used to achieve the greatest benefit to people living with rare conditions. And my background, really briefly, is in cancer genomics. I have a PhD from the University of Toronto, where I studied pediatric brain tumors, and I conducted my postdoctoral research fellowship at the National Cancer Institute, studying risk for second cancers in childhood cancer survivors. Before joining Allstripes, I was Director of Research Partnerships at Forensic Cancer Research, and over there led many different research studies and collaborations. And one of them that I think is relevant to today's conversation is on the work that we worked with the American Society for Clinical Oncology, or ASCO, on the modernization of eligibility criteria for inclusion into clinical trials, inclusion of patients into clinical trials. So very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Wonderful. Lanelle, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Sure. Hi, thank you. I'm Lanelle Doyle, and I am a mother, patient caregiver to a 14-year-old with severe eczema. Basically, he's had severe eczema for his entire life. And so pretty much our family has had severe eczema for 14 years.
It's wonderful to have you with us today, and it's such an important perspective. I think we focus a lot on participants, but really being able to understand that that's all happening in a context, especially when children are involved. So thanks for being here today. And last, certainly but not least, is Jordine Blaze from Bluebird Bio, a good friend and really an expert in the space on diversity and inclusion. So thrilled to have you here, Jordine.
Oh, thank you so much for the warm welcome and introduction. I'm really excited to share space with amazing panelists. Again, I'm Jordine Blaze. I'm the Director for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Bluebird Bio, a mid-sized biotech headquartered in Cambridge, Massachusetts, focusing on severe genetic disease and cancers, primarily cerebral adrenoleukodystrophy, transfusion-dependent beta thalassemia, sickle cell disease, and multiple myeloma, all severe, debilitating, and life-threatening diseases that impact patients in real and powerful ways. Bluebird Bio is an interesting bunch of folks who got together and said, we want to do science, but we want to do it differently. And we want to do it in a way that centers patients who are people at their core, right? And we want to think about the work that we're doing in the context of that. And so when I came on board a little over a year and a half ago, to sort of sit in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it was really important to us that our DEI program was built into the DNA of the company, right? So that we weren't just tacking this on into these varying spaces, or we weren't focusing only on recruiting, but we were looking holistically at how our work impacts communities outside of Bluebird, or outside of the nest, as we call it, including looking at our clinical trial diversity. And we started there saying, hey, we need to launch a task force to take a look at this and make sure that we're not relying on the diversity in the sickle cell community as an example. We know that that community is predominantly African American and Black, and so we didn't want to just rely on that as like, oh well, we've done it, right? We've gotten racial diversity in one disease state. So we were really intentional about thinking critically about how to expound on that and how to make sure that we build it in our programs and we build it systematically. We also did something. I hope to think that was brave. We decided to share our demographic data publicly. And so oftentimes people are looking at leadership photos and guessing about diversity within an institution or an organization. And we said, hey, if we're going to do this and we're going to take it seriously, we know we're not where we want to be, but we have to be really transparent and honest. And it's one of our company's kind of core principles is transparency. And we wanted to carry that through and really tell a story about the difficulties and the challenges associated with really building a diversity and inclusion program that doesn't just look at one aspect of diversity, but looks at diversity broadly and also looks at all the ways it impacts our work, both externally and internally. And so I think we've done it differently. I think we took a big step back and said, hey, what do we understand about race and racism and sexism and homophobia and transphobia, and how do we make sure that we're thinking critically about the way those issues impact not only the folks we work with, but impact our patients, but also impact the world around us. And so I think us taking an honest and critical look at those things has really kind of set us apart on this really incredible journey toward a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive Bluebird.
Well, that was really, it's wonderful to hear, Jordine. Obviously, we've benefited at Circuit from getting some undivided attention as you've helped our entire team think through these things. I think it's a very interesting thesis. It starts with, if I hear it correctly, that Bluebird's got the approach that if you want to be great on improving diversity in clinical trials, you have to reflect that internally. As you have to bring that into the organization before you can realize that change. And I think we're at this watershed, where these kinds of webinars around diversity and inclusion in clinical trials are well attended. There's questions asked. There's an interest in understanding more in how to make progress. So I'd love your take on what you see happening in the industry at this point. Do you think we're seeing teams move to more of this? Let's solve internally while we also try to improve engagement.
Absolutely. I'm famous for saying this saying this within Bluebird and outside of Bluebird is we talk a lot about distrust in underrepresented communities, right? Communities of color, other underrepresented categories, and why they distrust research, medical research, and medical systems. But I kind of flip that question on its head and say, why should they trust us? What do we know about them? What do we know about their lived experiences? How do we exercise care and demonstrate care for all that they're bringing to the table and who they are? We like to talk in industry about bringing your whole self to work. How do we think about the whole self in our patient populations? And how do we create an atmosphere where we are the vanguard, right? We are an institution that they should trust and then that should feel trusted versus relying on this sort of story, like this kind of mythology that lives without critique, right? That, oh my gosh, they don't trust us. What else can we do? Like, as if we don't play a role in sort of garnering and establishing that trust. And I think it starts with, if you trust me to treat you, then we need to see ourselves reflected in the body of your organization too, right? You should trust us, right? To be leaders in your organization, to make decisions, to research, to be scientists. And so I think that trust is kind of a two-way relationship. So I think no doubt we'll continue to see that trend across the industry.
That's really interesting to think about and hopeful. I think, Lanelle, I'd love for you to sort of share a little bit about the experience of trying to find a clinical trial and maybe even overcoming or at least exploring some of those trust issues and what that was all like as well.
Sure. Well, I said, as I said, my son has battled eczema since he was really young. So it was really a severe case. We tried everything. We've been to many different doctors, many different dermatologists, different types of dermatologists, and he just wasn't getting any better. So I was spending a lot of time scouring the internet because it just wasn't something that I was going to accept, that he wasn't going to be better. His childhood, his confidence, everything had taken a hit. Our entire family was built around basically his eczema. So I came across clinicaltrials.gov and I searched through. I read about the different studies, and I got to the point where I contacted the researchers of the studies that I was interested in so that I could actually talk to them. For me, that was a part of the trust building process. I needed to see what it was that they had to say. I needed to go back to the internet and reference the different, some of the different outcomes, look for drugs that had similar expected outcomes that I might find. And then I get an idea and then we talk about it. Safety was a big important thing because when you're dealing with your child, it's like this little diamond. It's a lot different. You're not willing to take as many risks. So, I had to feel comfortable with it. And ultimately, we thought that we had found a researcher that we were comfortable with, and they were close to my home. We have the luxury of being near a big metro area that has a lot of choices. Not to say that they're necessarily all the right choices, but there are a lot of choices.
That was wonderfully framed because, research may not be right for every potential participant. Right now, one of the big challenges we have, I think, when we look at improving access and really the option of participation is just creating that choice. I'd love to understand, Lanelle, was it straightforward, using clinicaltrials.gov as a mom looking for a solution for her child, or did you find that, how was that experience?
To be quite honest with you, none of it was straightforward. It's all quite confusing. What I would like to see is for that to be something that's available as an option given at treatment so that people even know that it exists. I had at some point vaguely heard of clinicaltrials.gov, but it never was important to me until it was something that I needed. And then it, materialized for me. Fortunately for me, I had the time to spend looking there. Then I had the ability to be able to do quite a bit of cross-referencing. We had been through a lot, so we were familiar with a lot of different types of medicine. And as I said, a lot of different actual dermatologists and things of that nature. So, it was just pretty much one of those points where preparation and opportunity meets. We call that luck. But it's more of a lot of work, to be quite honest. So I don't think that your average person who is not even aware that it's there would have such an easy time doing it.
I wholeheartely agree. I'm a cardiologist by training, and I've used clinicaltrials.gov looking for friends and family members, and it's an uphill fight. So I can't say enough about how impressed I am that you're able to navigate it to the point where you could find one. It's a useful database. We need it. But when we think about the struggles that patients and their loved ones have, especially those who aren't from a medical field, it really is. And Diana, this reminds me. We were exchanging kind of backgrounds, and I like to joke sometimes that I hit for the cycle. Been a patient, been the doc, run a research company. Your background, I think, too, is really interesting to talk about these different perspectives as we think about how do we engage patients differently, how do we show more empathy. I'd love for you to shed a little light on terms of your background, and both in terms of your personal background, but also in terms of your work, rare disease versus oncology, and where you think the opportunities are for improving access and equity.
Yeah, no, that's a loaded question. So I'll start with the beginning and try to end at the end. But yes, Irfan, I got interested in working in the medical research field because of my personal experience with disease. I'm a child cancer survivor. And I guess I can put on the multiple hats and be able to see things perhaps from different angles, different perspectives. I think that what Lanelle said earlier, just one of the words that came to mind was the burden that the patient and their families have to carry to be a part of research, to be a part of the solution that is hoping to find therapies, treatments for the conditions, but also just understand more about the condition itself. And that's where my personal experience and research background in cancer research, as well as what I'm doing now in the rare disease community, kind of merges. I think that all patients, all people affected by disease want to find a solution. They want to either contribute with their information, what they know from their lived experience, but also one of the things that I really like about the All Stripes platform is that there is a lot of data that is sort of locked in medical records. I know that I have medical records dating back, 20 plus years, and I don't know what's in there, and I can't easily give it to somebody who can do something with it. So my excitement about the All Stripes platform is that the whole point is to unlock the data that is currently only found in the medical records and make that available to understand more about the condition, but also try to identify therapies that can help with the condition. And I think that is one of the fundamental ways in which our world nowadays asking about how can we use the data? We live in a big data world, and there's a lot of data points out there. We need to understand how to better use it and how to understand how those things can help us move research forward, not only within the box, but also outside the box. So potentially thinking about, if we're talking about clinical trials, there is a very pristine way and methodology to record data within a clinical trial. But what happens outside the clinical trial, we don't really know, we can't really see. There is no standardized way of using data that is found from the outside of a clinical trial or real world evidence, real world data to help drive forward additional ways to get to the answer sooner, whether that answer in this particular case, talking about clinical trials, is identifying therapies that are safe and effective for patients. So the way that I see it, circling back to your original question of how is it that my experience being the patient, being the researcher, being the one who advocates for patients, how does it all frame my particular point of view? I think that number one, data is very important, and it's number two, the patients own the data, and we have data that can help solve issues. So number three is how can we best empower patients to use that data, to advocate for the use of that data and other of their own personal experiences to move the needle forward faster.
Yeah, it's wonderfully put. I'll ask a question then just to follow up with that, is that do you see there being a disparity in access to our healthcare data that exacerbates the problem of diverse patients, patients from diverse populations getting access to clinical trials, for example? We see disparities in healthcare pretty generally, and it's an interesting idea that actually the difficulties involved in accessing your own record may play a role in making access to clinical trials as a care option worse as well.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that there's a lot involved there. I feel like as a patient, I didn't know that I had a right to my data, and sometimes people who know that still call their institutions and ask for their data, and it's a lot. I don't know if Lanelle has had any experience with this, but it's a lot of work, and sometimes you have to call multiple times. Sometimes, I mean, in my case, I have data all over the place in different institutions, different countries, and I think that the other thing that I really liked about the All Stripes platform is that it removes the burden of collecting medical records from the patient and their families. So in the platform that All Stripes has, that burden falls on our clinical operations staff that actually calls on your behalf after the patient has signed the HIPAA consent about the use of the release of their medical records. And the team goes and starts calling everybody. And then once they get them, and sometimes they don't get them just because it's just so hard and time consuming to do that. But I think that the ability to just sign a form and get your medical records in one place is a huge service, in my opinion, as a patient myself. And that it should not depend on your education. It should not reflect your socioeconomic background. It should not reflect anything. Like, everybody has their own right to their own data. And I think that that's something that needs to be fully understood. No matter where you're coming from, no matter any other thing, that data is yours, and you have a right to access it.
It's a framework for talking about health literacy. There's a data literacy, almost a health information literacy that's required too. And there's this very persistent asymmetry between it is our data, our ability to access that data would not make you think it's our data, and it can have impacts. Jordine, how do you sort of see these sorts of challenges as kind of coming together to either make the problem better or worse?
Yeah, I so appreciate Diana's perspective, right? Because I can't underscore enough how challenging it can be. And I said earlier that I'm in a lot of reverence for both of my panelists here. And I'm going to reiterate that, because when I think about Lanelle and I think about other caregivers, you're not just a parent at this point. You are a healthcare specialist, you're a data collector, you are a researcher, you're a nutritionist, you're an expert in medical coding and billing. You have to know it all, right, in order to navigate this landscape to get appropriate access to care for your child or for your partner or for whomever you're a caregiver for, right? And when I think about diversity, and I think about the power of diversity to unlock this incredible potential to give us better context. When we think about COVID, right, we're sitting in the midst of this horrible pandemic. It gave us context, right? I think for a lot of folks, we're like, wow, I had no idea all the work that teachers do until I had my child at home and we were trying to get through this thing for 8 hours, and I was everyone's working and trying to do all these things, right? I think diversity, equity, and inclusion gives us that incredible context. So if you're a caregiver and you're trying to access care, you're trying to access medical records, et cetera, but you also have a job, your child is also, trying to get through their school day or trying to access education information. You may have other children, a partner in the home, other folks, you still want to do birthday parties or, go to the mall, when we're all open again, right? We're trying to battle and we're trying to juggle all of these things, right? And diversity, while yes, it is race and ethnicity and age and gender and sexuality, it is also understanding the context of our lives, right? Understanding how all of these things impact access to care. We even saw for the first time them saying like, racism is a pandemic in and of itself, right? Understanding the impacts of what's happening on the news on people's health. I absolutely think that while it can be limiting, I think what we're able to unlock in terms of understanding the impact of all of these things on our patients will lead us into an incredible, innovative future in terms of what we're able to provide patients once we get a handle on understanding how all of this context impacts their trial experience. From start to finish, how they experience and access care, how different people are received when you're making that phone call by your tone of voice or your race or your ethnicity, how people receive you, demanding access to something you have a right to access to. Making sure that we level the playing field across the board is going to be an incredible task for all of us, but I think it's worthwhile because I think that once we unlock that for these patients, who we're able to treat and how we're able to treat is only expanded upon.
Yeah, so Lanelle, I think that's a great sort of pivot point back to you. If you could wave a wand and make the process easier for caregivers and potential participants who are really looking for that option, especially patients coming from a diverse background and maybe not feeling like the trust level is as high as it could be, maybe as high as it is with their doctor they see every day. What kinds of things would you say could make a better experience? How could we improve essentially research as an opportunity for patients?
Well, you actually made a statement. You said healthcare literacy, and that was a really all-encompassing term because a lot of people really don't understand healthcare. I mean, much more than once a year you get a book from your insurance company. It's big, it's menacing, and you're, and you may never ever look at it. But those kind of things need to be made into a roadmap, understandable roadmap. They need to be, given to people so that they can understand it based on their lived experiences, their backgrounds. Each person's background is different. We do understand that, there are different challenges in different areas. You may have, I may have more time than say a person who's working several jobs and they're trying to, take care of their child. They may have more than one child that has a rare disease or a chronic illness, because these illnesses are chronic in nature. They tend to last a long time, regardless of, how many times people stop you and they give you their home remedy. At the end of the day, they're chronic. They last a long time. So, just a simple roadmap. These are the basics. This is where you can find more information. And it's in people speak so that people can understand it. I feel that clinical trials should be something that are offered as a possibility or an option for care. A lot of people don't even know that there really are clinical trials. Their first introduction to clinical trials has been with the COVID vaccine. And it's like, wow, they actually test this on real human beings. And then it's frightening at that point. You're already an adult, it's frightening. You haven't been familiar with it all along the way. So, in the very basic form, I think some type of a checklist, some type of information so that people can understand it needs to come from a trusted source, more dialogue.
I love the point you ended on. So, when we say it should come from a trusted source, what kinds of sources do you think would speak to communities who haven't normally been engaged in clinical trials?
Well, as Jordan did mention, your physician, and I think Diana also mentioned that too. A lot of times we do trust our physicians, but to be honest, sometimes people go to physicians because, again, they opened up that big menacing book and they found Dr. X and it said he took the insurance, and they go to Dr. X. They don't necessarily have a good relationship with him, but he's there. They can go, and they don't even really realize that they have the ability to switch to a different physician. So some type of community-based health in Dr. X's office or the region, I think is something that needs to be dispersed through a network of trusted sources. For each group, there are different things that people trust. Some people go to the exact same pharmacy. I won't get my medication filled anywhere else except CVS right here. There are tons and tons of CVSs, but is that CVS? Is that pharmacy? So, a network and the people who are delivering the information need to really want to. Something like this is something that you want to do. It's more than just a job. I want people to get this information.
That's a wonderful answer. You got some great questions here from the audience as well. Diana, I think I'll throw this one your way. What are some of the ways on the industry side? If we look at this and say, hey, look, we're doing a terrible job on diversity and inclusion in clinical trials. The classic example that jumps up is, you have myeloma trials with 5% African American participation, yet 30% of the people who get myeloma are African American. There's got to be huge holes in the data that gets produced. There's a concern about, if you're missing that chunk of the data, A, are you missing an opportunity to have a higher impact? And B, are you missing some dangers that the therapeutic could pose? What are some of the things that the industry itself should be looking to do better on diversity and inclusion?
That's a great question. And I agree, there's many different barriers. One of them that I don't think we've discussed yet is geographical location, because most clinical trials are based out of tertiary centers, medical hospitals that are associated with universities in big cities. And what happens to anybody who doesn't have access to that? Are we understanding what the safety and efficacy of a therapy is for anybody who does not fall within those catchment areas, or even people that fall outside of the inclusion-exclusion criteria for these clinical trials? And that is something that was addressed. As I said, I used to work at Friends of Cancer Research, and one of our big projects there was to work with ASCO and understand what are some of those barriers for access to clinical trials. And some of them are actually really silly. They're just grandfathered in from old protocols, and there's not really a rhyme or reason why they should be in the inclusion-exclusion criteria. So various different key opinion leaders come together and identified a few factors about what are some of those things that should be addressed to modernize eligibility criteria. And some of those were identified, such as like minimum age of inclusion. Why should it be 18? What happens to a 17-and-a-half-year-old who, for all intents and purposes, could be on a clinical trial if it wasn't for the age factor? Or how several previous conditions, comorbidities, in my case, for example, cancer survivors, because we've had some therapies given in the past, we cannot access future trials, even though there is no reason why we shouldn't. So all of those were addressed, and they have been published, and some of them have actually been included or have been taken up by the FDA. The FDA has revised some documentation for industry, some guidance for industry. So as industry, I think that one of the things that really resonated with me when I was working on this project is there needs to be justification, for the addition of inclusion-exclusion criteria into the protocols themselves. What that means is we need to think about, do I really think that excluding these type of people will be disadvantageous to the trial, yes or no? And whenever possible, include patients unless there is a scientific or medical reason why we should exclude them.
That's it makes a lot of sense, and it goes right to the heart of how do you drop the burden on the site? How do you drop the burden on the patients? And I think that those are the kinds of things that do seem to have an impact in terms of even helping communicate the opportunity. Jordine, a note here from the audience that I think is really interesting is that the advocates for a people-driven clinical research environment have typically experienced some firsthand battles with healthcare. I think that's true of all of us on this panel, and that's good. It creates empathy. It's certainly a way to go. But given the vast majority of people in our industry haven't, what can we do to educate sort of both sides of that market, both participants on the value, as Lanelle so eloquently noted, in terms of the improving the ability to make the choice and to evaluate research care as an option, as well as on the other side in terms of, hey, there are things that need to get better. If we're going to go ahead and put together this trial, here are our direct actions to ensure we end up with a balanced population, representative population. So what are some of those things that you think that are sort of top of the list?
Yeah, I think for me, top of the list is centering patient and caregiver voices, right? I think I think we're sort of built in society. Like, you have a medical degree, you're a doctor. I already center your voice. I trust you. You got this. How do we? I think Diana said it earlier. They have the most comprehensive data available because they were there, they lived it, right? And so, how do we center their voices from the start? I think on the industry side, from conception, so clinical trial design teams, one of our first steps was why are we not building in a check here, right? At the very beginning when we're designing this, who's being excluded, who are we missing, really examining our criteria from get up, right, to make sure that our criteria is not unintentionally excluding folks. Also, peeping into patient voices and care and doctors, right? So sometimes we're not aware of the exclusion criteria and how it excludes people, but actually talking to patients and talking to doctors can open up for us understanding that we had no idea this minor criteria that was just, as someone said, it was left here. It's a legacy criteria from real life doctors, patients, and practitioners are telling us oh, if you remove this, we can expand this, because it hurts them to not be able to include patients who need it in their trials because of some criteria that wouldn't ultimately affect the research in the long term.
Yeah, and that leads to maybe just one last question for each of you, which would be, if we were to do as an industry collective things to improve the situation as it exists today, how would we know it's working? If we look at a year from now or 2 or 3 years from now, how would we know that any of this energy that we're all bringing to the question and keeping the question, and I'm very appreciative to NewYorkBIO for creating this space for this conversation to happen. How do we look forward a year from now and say, hey, this wasn't just a moment of interest given everything happening in the country, and it's a reflection of that larger awareness for a brief window in time, but actually, no, in that window, concrete steps were taken. So, Lanelle, I'll start with you. What would you like to see as a concrete sort of, okay, we're doing better at this?
Well, I would think that more diversity actually in the clinical trials, as far as any of the groups. And I think that actually afterwards, seeing more people having access and understanding and knowing that these clinical trials are available and knowing that they're an option, that you're not just hopeless when you get to that point where it seems like all other conventional medicine that's available has stopped working. For the physicians and the actual medical community to be offering it, to talk about it more, to actually seek people for the trials and let them know they're there and give them more information, more of the health or as we said before, the education that goes along with understanding what your options are for everybody.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Diana, any last thoughts on that one?
I think that one of the first things that comes to mind is potentially we could see time to accrual reduce as a proxy to see whether the reduction of barriers to access clinical trials will help get patients registered as quickly as possible. That's one of the first things that comes to mind. And also just to do retrospective analysis of how changes, for example, in the case of the inclusion of patients with brain metastases in clinical trials for breast cancer. I think there was a paper not so long ago that outlined that by including patients with brain metastases, they were still able to get to their primary and secondary outcomes faster, because this had been a common exclusion criteria in some clinical trials in the past. So just doing some retrospective research and also seeing whether that time to accrual gets cut down by including more patients in the trials.
Jardine, I'll give you the last quick word in this as we wind down. What will be an early indicator we're making progress?
Well, selfishly, as a company that works in the multiple myeloma space, I would love to see our clinical trials represent the racial and ethnic diversity of multiple myeloma patients as a full starting point. And broadly for the industry, I really just want a built-in mechanism by which we are understanding the socioeconomic, the urban versus rural, the racial, ethnic, sexuality, all of these aspects of diversity of our patient populations from the start. So we know what good looks like and we know what we're measuring against for each of our trials that we're embarking on.
It's a wonderful note to leave it on. I'd like to thank NewYorkBIO, Lanelle Doyle, Diana Vega, and Jardine Blaze for this great conversation. Great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for NewYorkBIO's first Patient Engagement Summit. All of the panels from the event can be found online on NewYorkBIO's YouTube channel, and we hope they will be shared and heard. We want to thank our sponsors and our partners for coming together to help build an exceptional event, and we hope to see you next year at what will be our second annual Patient Engagement Summit. Until then,